Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
So this book, which has just come out 2 weeks ago, is somewhat ironic in its timing. 5 days from today, we will be marking the 50th anniversary of the imposition of the emergency by Indira Gandhi on 25th of June, 1975. And I say it's a little ironic because this book was not timed to come out at the emergency. It's come out, and we can talk about how that might have happened. But in some ways, when I began working this book on what now seems an embarrassingly long time ago, the idea was actually to sort of look at the entire arc of Indira Gandhi's career and somewhat take the focus away from the emergency itself, which seemed to occupy all our sort of mental, intellectual, conversational energies whenever she was mentioned as a figure. And the idea of doing that was not so much to minimize the importance of the emergency. In fact, even in this book, the emergency has 2 pivotal central chapters which are allocated to it, but to more or less kind of decenter the emergency in our understanding, which is to say, not to imagine that the emergency was the end point towards which everything was tending or the inflection point from which everything has gone wrong. I think one of the ways in which I wanted us to start thinking about this period, frankly, for myself to start thinking about this period as I researched this book, was to think of the entire period that I've characterized in this book as the long 1970s. By the long 1970s, I really mean a delimited historical period which stretches from approximately 1966-67 till about the mid-1980s. And what I suggest in the book is that that really is the period in which the contemporary history of India turns, right? From the early formative sort of years, which for shorthand we can call Nehruvian, to something that looks closer to the India in which we all live today. So how did we get from there to here is really the story that I wanted to tell in this book, as much as the story of Indira Gandhi's political career, the various kinds of choices that she made, the various kinds of decisions that she took, and the impact that all of that really had. Now, as I said, I started working on this book maybe about 12, 13 years ago, or maybe 14. And at that point of time, I was just trying to finish a book on the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, in which, of course, again, Indira Gandhi was a central figure. But that book was explicitly pitched as a global history of the creation of Bangladesh, partly because I just felt that thinking of it purely as a regional, a subcontinental kind of affair was not doing justice to many important dimensions, which led to this extraordinary outcome, which was the creation of a very important new state in South Asia itself. And while I was working on that book, I came across a number of archival kind of materials, which at least to me were new at that point of time. Not just the sort of papers of some of her closest advisors, P.N. Huxer, B.K. Nehru, and many others, but also many of her contemporaries, colleagues, adversaries, antagonists, right? For instance, the papers of Chaudhry Charan Singh became available around the same time in the Teen Murti library. Morarji Desai's papers got almost fully declassified in the period that I was working. So you had a sort of a view of the person and of the events, not just from her office, as it were, but also from those who were ranged up against her throughout this period. More importantly, from about 2014, about 10 years ago, the National Archives of India started declassifying a lot of archival material pertaining to this period, which again to me was surprising, because we all tend to think of the National Archives as this kind of slightly haphazard organization which does things to its whim. But much to my surprise, the richness of the material that is now available to study this period is quite extraordinary, including files from the Prime Minister's Secretary, right? So literally from the desk from which a lot of things were done or sought to be done in that time, we can look at what was happening. So for me, this book turned out to be a longer project, partly because I wanted to make full use of this kind of archival bounty that it opened up and was continuing. What was a trickle in 2014 became a flood by 2020 or thereabouts. And I was really struggling to keep on top of all the materials that were becoming available. So this book eventually has ended up telling a story which runs along 2 tracks, which do intersect, of course. The first is the story of Indira Gandhi, her years in power, her coming to power, her years in power, including the period when she was out in wilderness before coming back. But it is also an attempt to situate Indira Gandhi's political career, the kind of political choices that she made, all the actions that she took within the backdrop of the long 1970s, as it were, right? So the idea is both to tell the political story of Indira Gandhi, but also to track and explain these extraordinary changes which happened this time. And as I said, those two things do come together in ways that are quite interesting for us to understand. So what do I mean by saying that, this period of the long 1970s has some kind of unity? And I'd say, again, this unity is not simply an artifact of us understanding this period as the Indira Gandhi era in Indian politics, but rather of saying that if you look at the history of the 20th century, the long 1970s has a certain kind of, periodic unity to itself, which I think is very important for us to remember, because that sort of global 1970s, as it were, impinged on a lot of what was happening in India, and in fact was quite decisive at certain moments, right? So if you want to plot some of the highlights of that, I would say let's begin with the period of 1967-68, which historians refer to as a global 1968. That's when youth revolts across the world were kicking off. Yeah, you saw the emergence of young people as important agents of social change in the context of countries across the world, right? Not just in United States, where there was an anti-Vietnam War kind of protest, but also in countries like France and Germany. China had its cultural revolution going on. Interestingly enough, one of the countries where this phenomenon of 1968 really had an impact was in our neighborhood in Pakistan, where a student movement actually led to the overthrow of the authoritarian regime of Ayub Khan in 1969, right? So global 1968 really, as historians call it, is one interesting starting point. From there, you move up the arc to, say, the period between 1971 and 74. This is a period when the global economy really gets into a new kind of an orbit. Because what happens in 1971 is the decision of the United States of America to exit the Bretton Woods system of international monetary arrangements, which means that previously exchange rates between currencies used to be fixed, and they were all pegged to the dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold, right? So there's a fixity. You could predict exactly what is the exchange rate of currency. Richard Nixon in August 1971 decides to get the United States out of anchoring that system, which then means that you have a global economy where exchange rates are suddenly floating. And nobody really knows how to sort of even think about a system like that and manage it. So that is the first kind of, vector of economic turbulence, which really is, again, global in scale. The second thing is something that happens as a result of the Arab-Israeli War of October 1973, which leads to the Arab countries in OPEC, the petroleum cartel, to jack up oil prices almost by 4 times in a matter of about 4 months. So oil prices go from about $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel by the end of 1974. And that means literally seismic levels of inflationary shock to the global economy. And between this exchange rate crisis and this oil shocks, the entire global economy really is in a great period of turbulence. And that has direct and extreme consequences for a country like India. In 1974, India actually experiences its most concentrated period of inflation. It's the sharpest kind of inflationary period in all of India's 20th century history, right? The history of Indian economy. Again, by the time countries are kind of gearing up, learning to deal with this extraordinary sort of turbulence, which is both an economic, a financial, and an energy crisis, by 1979, you have the second oil shock, which happens as a result of the Iranian revolution, right? Again, in the backdrop of what's happening today, it's important to remember what a shock by supply side of Iran deciding to sort of, again, hike oil prices meant. And in 1979, again, the impact on India was extraordinary. We now tend to forget that in the year 1979, the Indian economy contracted by 5%. It is the sharpest, negative 5% GDP growth, sharpest contraction of the Indian economy in that period, right? Which then meant that, India had to move towards the IMF for a major loan in 1980. And then you started embarking on a series of kind of economic reforms, et cetera, which then play out later in the context of globalization, right? So this entire period from about 1967 to the mid 1980s is a period of extreme change, and change at a pace and velocity which is actually now very difficult for us to grasp, but also of extreme turbulence. And democratic states across the world were caught up in this stuff, right? I mean, we tend to think of the Indian emergency as this extreme instance of the imposition of outright authoritarian rule. But one of the salient facts of the global 1970s is that very few democratic governments actually got re-elected. Most of them were struggling to sort of master this particular crisis which was thrown upon them. And so India is really only at the extreme end of what is a spectrum of problems that many other democracies are facing. So we are not a kind of outlier entirely to this larger story, which is why I wanted to pitch the changes of this period against the backdrop of this global crisis, right? So let's go back to the sort of inaugural moment of Indira Gandhi's ascent to power, and I'll kind of take you through very quickly. We can talk greater at length. I'm sure Arun will draw me out on things which are very telegraphic here. So Indira Gandhi's ascent to prime ministership in early 1966 happens against the backdrop of two sort of prime ministerial transitions which happened. 1964 with Jawaharlal Nehru, January 1966, Lal Bahadur Shastri's very unexpected demise in Tashkent. It happens on the back of two wars that India has fought, 1962 against China and 1965 with Pakistan. And it happens against the backdrop of 2 years of successive drought, which means that this predominantly agrarian economy is experiencing a very serious situation which is bordering on famine in various parts of India, right? So these sort of crises, which are the backdrop against which Indira Gandhi comes to power, manifest themselves in the 1967 election in terms of a series of setbacks for the Congress party, right? Now, the Congress party up until that time is a dominant political player in Indian politics, not just in the way that we think of as a party which has a majority. Congress parties in its heyday, in the period between 1937 to 1967, dominated Indian politics at all levels, right? They dominated at the union federal level, they dominated at the state level, they dominated right at the local level, right? At every level, there was a dominance of the Congress, which is why it's called something like a one-party dominant system, is the way that political scientists used to characterize that old Congress. But that old Congress took a very bad knock in the 1967 elections. Back in the day, both general elections and state elections used to happen simultaneously. In the general elections, the Congress's majority became a bare majority, 283, and the Congress lost control of very important states, particularly in North India, right? So in a sense, the Hindi heartland really sort of started slipping out of the Congress's control. 1967, soon after the elections sort of happened, within a couple of months, you had another kind of political signal which goes up, which suggests that things are not all that good, which is the beginning of a revolt in this place called Naxalbari in West Bengal, which then leads to the rise of a insurrectionary movement, which is entirely opposed to the Indian state and the constitution and everything else, right? So what it shows is that the political system as a whole is in crisis. It is not just the Congress party which is in crisis, but the Congress's crisis is a systemic crisis, because the Congress is so much the part of the system at that point of time, right? It's the behemoth. At the same time, because of these economic problems, drought, wars, everything, it means that your major sort of instrument through which economic development is being thought of, which is planning and the planning commission, the 5-year plans, etc., are set aside. The Indira Gandhi government in 1967 sends off the planning commission on what is dubbed as a planned holiday. They put them in abeyance for a couple of years. They say, we'll revive you when times are better, right? So this is a perfect storm. And it is in this perfect storm that Indira Gandhi comes to power. And, when she comes to power, she has very few concrete ideas about what she wants to do. I think the one thing we can be sure about is that her view of how to deal with these crises was that she actually aimed at something like a restoration to the Nehruvian model, right? She felt that what she needed to do was to provide enough stability so that the country could go back to the sort of principles and practices which characterize the Nehruvian period, right? Which is Congress dominance, but also a stable, planned kind of economic development, moving towards greater state sort of control of the commanding heights, socialism, quote unquote. We can discuss that, what that ever meant. But her vision really was to restore, and she always saw herself. And one of the reasons she comes forward in 1966, even 1964, when Jawaharlal Nehru dies, congressmen in the usual sycophantic style, tell her that, listen, you should just, put your name forward. And she says, no, I'm not, I have other things to worry about. But in 66, she really feels that in the face of all of these crises, the country is going to be taken in some very different direction, and that, she is somehow the restorative kind of agent. And the irony that this book tries to underline is that while Indira Gandhi turned out to be the most powerful sort of dominant politician of India in the next 17 years, she had this vision with which she came. But what actually she ended up accomplishing were a series of things which were totally orthogonal to her restorative vision of what she wanted to do, right? And those changes you could see happened in three main areas. I'll quickly sort of go over them. One was in the domain of the political system. The second was in the mode or style of politics that she inaugurated. And the third was in the domain of what you think of as political economy, right? Now, each of these three things were changes which I think were very, very significant. These are the most important changes of the long 1970s. And it is those changes which really link that era to the India in which we live, right? And hopefully we'll give you a sense of what that is. So let's talk about each of these very quickly in turn. So when I say changes in the political system, I do not simply mean the rise of new political actors. Like, say, for instance, there were new groups like, dominant peasant communities, farmers, like Charan Singh in Uttar Pradesh, the rise of OBCs and Dalits as important actors. All of that is true. But I'm talking about changes which are systemic in a sense that they affect all actors in the system. And when we think about systemic change in that sense, I think it's important for us to think about it along two vectors, right? So the first axis of systemic change is what you would think of as the institutional kind of game which is being organized and played out in any political system, right? In the context of India, it is really about the powers and functions that separate various branches of government, right? So you have the executive, you have parliament or the legislature, and you have the judiciary, right? And each of these has a certain area in which it has powers, it has certain functions that it's supposed to do. In theory, this is a system of all kinds of checks and balances, which is supposed to ensure that, and much of this is laid down in the constitution about what are the various kinds of power which are there, right? Now, this aspect of the Indian political system, which is the first aspect, undergoes a dramatic change in a sense that the executive in the period between 1967 and 1974 becomes extraordinarily powerful in comparison both to the legislature or the parliament and to the judiciary, right? So there is a huge shift in the balance of power towards the executive. Now, how does that happen? It happens in the first instance because Indira Gandhi is, after the 1967 defeat in Congress party, in order to consolidate her own position within the party, decides to break the Congress party. The new party which is created is Congress R, as it is called, is Indira Gandhi's party. She obviously has much greater control. But what gives her complete dominance over the party, the Congress party, which she has split, is her victory in 1971, which was quite unanticipated. It was a gamble. She called elections 1 year earlier. She took a gamble and it paid off. She won an extraordinary victory. And then there was the victory later that year against Pakistan in the Bangladesh crisis, which then meant that Indira Gandhi was being described by the economist tongue-in-cheek as the Empress of India. And then you had state elections in 1972 because only the central, general elections had been called 1 year ahead. And in the state elections, the Congress party just sweeps everything, right? So the Congress is once again restored to its extraordinary dominance in the political system. But all of that is now seen as being due to Indira Gandhi. In fact, rather than the party being the agency which delivers power, the entire party is beholden to the prime minister in ways that are unprecedented in the history of Indian politics. Even Jawaharlal Nehru always accepted the restraints that the Congress party imposed. That was not true of Indira Gandhi from December 1971, certainly after 1970. And that meant that the parliamentary party, or which is to say that portion of the party which is represented in parliament, is no longer a check on the executive. I mean, normally, you think of a figure like Boris Johnson, right? I mean, why was Boris Johnson exited from power? Because his own party in parliament said that we cannot support your policies, right? So you need to have that subtle kind of check which the party exercises on the prime minister. That goes away. Then the party has this extraordinary majority, not just in parliament, but in states, which means that all your super majoritarian constitutional amendments, 2/3, etc., 50% of states can now be passed, right? And when the executive has become dominant over both the party and parliament, Mrs. Gandhi in 1973 then turns on the judiciary, right? There is a running battle between the judiciary and the executive in Indira Gandhi's tenure over a range of things, particularly around the question of the parliament's right to amend the constitution. Are there any limits on that? That's the question. We can discuss more. Arun is more of an expert on that matter than I am. And she wants to make a point that, that's not the case. The parliament, because it represents the people, has absolute kind of prerogatives to amend. And in order to make sure that the Supreme Court is pliant, she actually supersedes the two senior most judges of the Supreme Court and puts in her own appointment, right? So by 1973, effectively, the the balance of power in this very carefully established system of checks and balances has totally sort of concentrated in one highly powerful executive, right? So that is the first most important systemic change that happens, because then everyone has to respond to what that means for themselves, whether affirmatively or negatively, right? The second aspect of systemic changes is what you would say are not so much rules and functions or powers and functions of various kinds of branches of government, but what are the rules of the game by which any form of democratic politics is to be, right? I mean, any human activity requires certain kinds of rules, right? I mean, you want to play cricket, you have to abide by certain kinds of rules. We cannot constantly keep saying that we will not agree with those rules and still claim that we are playing cricket, right? In a similar way, parliamentary democracy also has a set of rules, norms, conventions, precedents. Many of them are written, unwritten, but obeying or whatever, at least abiding by them in most circumstances is the only safe way to play this game. But what happens from 1967? Because 1967 is the first serious competitive election in Indian politics. You have a number of state governments which are not belonging to the Congress. So that then sets in train a whole series of horse trading of legislatures, poaching people, destabilizing governments, using powers under the constitution to put assemblies under suspended animation, dismiss them, etc. Right? The rules of the game, so to speak, start unloosening quite quickly from 1967 onwards. Right? By 1972, the parliamentary opposition, which has been totally decimated between the 1971 and 72 elections, decides that, listen, there is just no way that you can take on the Congress party in these kinds of polls under a prime minister who is so, so to speak, so powerful and so popular, etc. And then from 1974, when student agitation begins, and the student agitation begins under the impact of the inflationary pressures that I spoke about, right? I mean, that is what triggers the student agitations first, but then it takes on a political cast, which first calls for the resignation of the government of Congress government in Gujarat. Subsequently, a similar claim is made for Bihar. And then there is a movement which Jayaprakash Narayan leads, which basically is about Navnirman and so on, right? But what is happening throughout this period, especially between 1972 and 1975, is that the parliamentary opposition more or less decides that hitting the streets and demanding for resignations of governments is a better way of dealing with the Congress party and Indira Gandhi's power rather than looking to play the election game, right? In 1974, there's a state election in Uttar Pradesh. And the opposition loses that, even though the UP Congress is in complete disarray, right? So that is more or less the last straw which breaks the camel's back as far as they are concerned. So by the time you come to 1975, both the concentration of power has become very extreme, and in consequence and concomitantly, you have a total unwillingness on the part of practically every player in the political system to play by what I've described as the rules of the game. Of course, the most important such player was the Prime Minister herself. And in fact, I quote in the book, I found a letter that she wrote to Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist, right? I mean, you may wonder why she was writing to Yehudi Menuhin. He actually wrote to her after the emergency saying that he was very sad that she deposed an emergency. And she writes, this is like 2 or 3 days after the emergency is imposed. She says, democracy is not an end in itself. Democracy is only one means to get to the final end, which is national unity, security, prosperity, etc. Right? This is an extraordinary statement, if you think about it, for the Prime Minister of India to say that she doesn't actually believe that there is any substantive value to democratic proceduralism altogether. Right? But that is the broad normative framework within which this transition has happened. Right? And as I said, unless and until we understand that kind of broad gauge change which happened, it's actually very difficult to understand how we got to something like the emergency. I mean, think about it this way, right? I mean, most of our discussions on the emergency, even today, tend to be about why did Indira Gandhi impose the emergency? It's a fair question, right? So, there are different kinds of answers you could give. One answer was that she imposed the emergency because the Allahabad High Court ruling of 12th June 1975 basically said that her election as member of parliament was voided, set aside. Then she got a conditional stay from the Supreme Court, which said you can continue as member of parliament, but you cannot kind of stay on, you cannot vote in as you can stay on in office as prime minister, but not vote as member of parliament, etc. So her legitimacy is imperiled. And that is the most immediate impetus and reason for her to, go after that. Now, Indira Gandhi herself maintained practically till the end of her life, and you can see various kinds of YouTube videos of interviews that she gave in the later 70s when she was out of power. She always said that, listen, there was a major serious internal security threat to India. And the fact is that, neither the Shah Commission nor historians like me have found any evidence of such a threat, because no such assessment was ever sent up to the Prime Minister. But she actually has extraordinary responses. I think somebody from the BBC asked her, and she says, "You think the Prime Minister of India gets intelligence only from Intelligence Bureau and these police in India?" Of course not. I have my own sources. But she maintained it throughout, right? So, and we can have those kinds of discussions about why she imposed the emergency. Was there a threat? Was it simply to hold on to power, etc.? But I think we must make a distinction between Indira Gandhi's intentions behind imposing an emergency and how an event like the emergency actually came about. Those are two different questions to my mind. They are related, but they are different questions. Because what caused the emergency is a question which forces us to ask this question of saying, how does a system which apparently has all of these checks and balances, all of these countervailing pressures, which is organized on principles of democratic legitimacy, popular sovereignty, actually literally on the stroke of a pen moves towards outright authoritarianism? How was that possible? And that was only possible because of the story that I've been telling you of the concentration of power in the hands of the executive, of the loosening of the rules of the game, including on the part of the Prime Minister, who believes that democracy has no procedural substantive value as far as she's concerned. So without that prior change happening, you actually could not have had the emergency. So in some ways, the only thing that the 12th June verdict did was to make sure that thereafter the imposition of the emergency was more or less unavoidable. Unavoidable because all the other checks and balances which are there to prevent such an outcome are no longer in place. So which is why I believe that, instead of focusing purely on the emergency, purely on what Indira Gandhi wanted, we have to look at this larger systemic transformation of Indian politics, which happened in this period, right? And that continues in the post-emergency period as well. The Janata government comes in, they undo some of the worst aspects of the emergency, but this kind of derogation of the rules of the game is a continuing game. So one of the things that the Janata government does, for instance, is to dismiss all Congress state governments soon after the 1977 election. They say you have no legitimacy, you lost such a bad election, your leader herself has lost all power. Why are you in power? Right? Now, by what rules of the Indian constitution or of parliamentary democracy is that an acceptable thing? But the interesting thing is the Supreme Court actually rubber stamps that also. Yeah. And of course, Indira Gandhi's logic has always been what's sauce for goose is sauce for gander, right? So when she comes back to power in 1980, she does exactly the same. Dismisses all the Janata state government. And the Supreme Court once again rubber stamps that. So what you see is that the whole aspect of the normative kind of structuring of parliamentary democracy and the rules which are required to be there are consistently being sort of eroded, disregarded throughout this period, which is why you have so much political turbulence in the long 1970 in Indian politics, right? So this is again something that is not, you cannot pinpoint it only on Indira Gandhi. It's a larger systemic sort of change which happens during that period, right? Similarly, as I said, one of the other things that Indira Gandhi wanted to do was to kind of take India back to the Nehruvian model of planned economic sort of policy making, etc., right? But what she actually ended up doing was something quite orthogonal to that particular intent to restore to something which was older, right? And what she did initially was actually to adopt a short period of liberalization in 1966 under the advice of the World Bank in the United States. She actually agreed to devalue the Indian currency, undertake certain reforms. There was huge, immediate sort of blowback, including from the Congress party. So she put all of that on hold. Then subsequently, when she broke the party and she wanted to sort of signal that she has more progressive leftist credentials, etc., she pushed for much greater levels of state control over the economy, right? I mean, that is the period when you have the Monopolies Act, which is being passed. You have various kinds of ways of controlling foreign investment in India through the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. I mean, an entire stranglehold of institutions is imposed on private enterprise in particular, right? And she believes that that is the road to socialism. But what her government starts realizing pretty much from 1971 onwards itself, once the Bretton Woods and the foreign exchange crisis kicks in, but certainly from 1973 when the oil shocks hit, is that this is a recipe for economic disaster. And very quickly, from about late 1973, they start backpedaling. In fact, in 1974, India goes to the IMF to sort of negotiate for a loan. And as part of that, adopts a very sort of conservative macroeconomic policy, inflation, wage freezing, in a sense of not agreeing for DAs despite inflation, etc. This is a very tough conservative macroeconomic policy. In fact, the first thing she says, when the emergency is imposed, is that one of the things I want to do during this emergency is to keep inflation under control. That is how conservative the so-called socialist has become under the pressure of the global economic crisis of the 1970s. And that is pretty much what continues. So through the emergency, you have a gradual attempt to unravel some of the more onerous sort of restraints which have been placed on the private sector to allow a very slow, halting, unwilling level of deregulation. It is done under the pressure of circumstance. That is the important thing for us, not because of any ideological conviction, policy conviction. You are just forced to do it in order to survive, keep the show going. And there is a much more sort of pro-business attitude which already comes in during the emergency, which is why someone like J.R.D. Tata actually says that the emergency has done a few good things for us. I mean, why are we thinking that this regime is totally bad? And this continues through. In fact, when Mrs. Gandhi comes to power in 1980, and she wins a spectacular election just 3 years after that very, gloomy loss, there is a reception held for her in Ashok Hotel in New Delhi, and which she attends. And her host is a person who has recently become very prominent in the Indian business circle called Dhirubhai Ambani, right? So the fact was that the Indian business community actually wanted Mrs. Gandhi back to power, precisely because of that negative 6% growth, the whole shock which was being delivered by global forces. They just felt that she's a much better bet for stability, and which is exactly what she goes on to do, more pro-business, opening up, again, under the pressure of having to do things for the IMF and so on. So what you see in terms of our economic policies, at least at the level of macroeconomic policies, etc., is this kind of actually and somewhat unwilling and unwitting move towards liberalization, right? So this is a person who's come in saying that she wants to take you back to Nehruvian socialism, but ends us getting up to some very different location, which is one of the sort of ironies. But the other thing which she does during this period, which again is a consequence of the kinds of failures of economic development that India was facing in this period, is to put on road an entire new imaginary of how we tackle poverty. And that was through targeted anti-poverty welfare schemes and so on. She was the one who began. In fact, the bank nationalization story was important precisely because it enabled her to get fiscal resources in order to be able to do those kinds of policies, right? And today, those policies are, you look at any day's newspapers and any part of this country, whether it is national, local, or regional level news, it is these welfare schemes which dominate the imaginary of what development means, right? So once again, in a very real sense, by turning her back on the older developmental model, which the Nehruvian era sort of actually heralded, she ended up taking us somewhere very different. So what I want to leave you, therefore, is with a sense that, at a moment like this, when 50th anniversary of the emergency, when we are going to be focusing a lot on the excesses that happened, obviously we should learn a lot of things about what happened, what went wrong in the emergency. I do talk about all of that in the book. But I think it's also very important for us to ask certain deeper and more fundamental questions about how actually was it possible for a democracy to kind of, at a stroke of the pen, kind of slide into an authoritarian system. And the only reason that could have happened was because so many things had already sort of gone awry with that system and continued to go awry subsequently, right? Similarly, I would like to just leave you with this idea that no matter how powerful an individual, no matter how powerful a political leader, their intentions and what they actually accomplished historically tend to be somewhat divergent. And in this case, I think Indira Gandhi sort of wanted to go back to the Nehruvian period, but ended up taking somewhere towards 1991, if not quite there. So let me stop here. Arun, we can have.
But thanks, Srinath. I think I've had to read the book in about a week's time. I'm still processing it. But I think your summary and the themes that you broadly spoke about give us a lot to talk about. So I'll just start by saying a little bit about so Sandhya introduced Srinath and mentioned his books. I think this is your sixth book in the last 15 years. And there's a way in which a lot of Srinath's work, as he explained, the 71 war book, it seems almost like this book is the culmination of a lot of things, going back to your first book, which I had read, and the Nehruvian era and the wars that were undertaken while he was still Prime Minister. All of that seems to feed into this. Right? With the benefit of hindsight, one can see that you've drawn from all those projects. But let me just start with a general question. And there's been a debate in the country. You are now a professionally trained historian on the value of popular history versus academic history, right? And much has been said by people on both sides of the aisle. I think you are in a fairly unique position because this book is very much, for my purposes, an academic book. I read it as an academic. If you read the prologue, which is about 30 pages, and there's a short epilogue for 10 pages or so, And in the middle, you get 10 substantive chapters, which follow the chronological order that Srinath has just told us, starting from her appointment. So chapter 1 starts with her appointment as Prime Minister in 66 and goes all the way till chapter 10. We end with the assassination. Right? And it's a pretty gripping account. As you can tell, even from his presentation, Srinath has an unusual mastery of dates and times and is able to sort of pack all that in. I read fiction as a respite from academic work. And as I was reading this, I said, I'm getting a little confused of whether I'm reading a thriller or I'm reading an academic work. Right? And I mean this in a really good way. And I think there's a lot here. What I will do is, let me start with that first question, because I think, as I said, this is both a work of academic history. It has a 30-page endnote section, which is full of citations to really good academic work. Srinath is also pushing against a lot of conventional ideas about Indira Gandhi's term, both in the field of politics, as a leader, and political economy, which I think this book is really pushing the boundary of established thought when it comes to political economy in particular. And some of my questions will be about that. But at the same time, I think it can, somebody who doesn't come with a foreknowledge of that academic work will also find this work very interesting because it is designed to draw in people. Right? There's a certain literary flair that Srinath has, and it's not going to put off somebody who wants an accessible introduction, or more than an introduction, elaboration of this period. So my first question is, would you want to comment on this supposed divide between popular history and academic history and say something?
No, thanks, Arun. I think that's an interesting question. So, see, again, let me just first lay my cards on the table, right? I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have no formal degree in history. So, in a sense, by standards of most professional historians, I wouldn't count as one of them. I mean, I think the last time I took any history course which is on my transcript is in grade 10. So, I'm purely a historian by practice, by inclination, and by training by myself, rather than having to sit through. I mean, of course, I now have a sort of an appointment in a department of history, but so in a sense, I have always seen myself as slightly, outside the academic configuration of South Asian history. That's partly been because of the kinds of topics that I've worked on. As you said, things like military history, diplomatic, international history are not things that are career-making moves in the world of South Asian history. So, if any of you are looking to do things, then I'd advise you to look elsewhere, right? I mean, I only ended up doing those things because I was in an international relations kind of department. So, I mean, now in terms of substantively, whether there is a distinction between, popular history and academic history, well, I mean, I think there are stylistic differences which you can immediately pick up. I mean, I think most academic history tends to speak to other academic historians, which means that you are engaged in presenting your materials in a way that interrogate and plays your contribution. That's what counts in that world. I suppose popular history is more about, trying to get a certain kind of understanding that you have developed of a certain period or a topic across to a wider range of people. Now, so I think if you leave that kind of stylistic tick aside, it's actually not very clear to me that there is that much to be said about the distinction. Right? Now, I think what, at least in the Indian context, tends to happen is that there is a sense that if you are doing popular history, it only has to be a certain class of narrative storytelling. Right? Now, storytelling is very important to historians, right? I mean, narrative is the principal device through which we explain change. So I will never deride storytelling as just storytelling. Very important. It's a very important tool for us to work with. But I think what I find is problematic is this idea that, listen, the only thing that historians should do is to tell you a good story, right? I think we have to do a little bit more than telling you a good story. We have to tell you why the story turned out the way it did, right? So explaining change over time is, I think, fundamental to any serious historical enterprise, whether that's done by a popular historian or by an academic historian, is, I think, only a matter of, right? I mean, to me, the most important question that I ask when I read a book of history is not just, is the story interesting? Have I learned more? But also about how does the explanation actually hold up, right? And when I was writing this book, I was very keen both to be able to reach out to a wider audience. That's why this book is published with trade publishing and a trade imprint. But at the same time, I was very clear that I also wanted to have this kind of explanatory analytical thrust, which is, to me, a very central aspect of understanding what the story is all about. So much of the challenge, really, and I have to thank my editors here, was to actually make that kind of more analytically driven sort of narrative line understandable and graspable to people who don't have a background in terms of knowing the details of these things. So I think, and to do it within what to me seemed like a short compass, right? Because I've written books which are at least 50% bigger than this. I know that not many people have had the misfortune like you of having to read them. So I thought this time around I'll try a shorter book so that I can inflict it on more of you if I can sort of get away with it.
Yeah, thanks. So, another related question. I guess when I saw the title, and in history, there's a debate over great man or great woman history, right? And in a sense, the title seems to suggest this is about a significant political leader, and that's what you're engaging. But I think you've explained this also, that you're interested in change. And I think the way in the presentation you said the question of why did Indira Gandhi impose the emergency is an important question. And I think you deal with that quite significantly in the 2 chapters that you talk about. But you're interested in another set of questions. So maybe a little bit also on that.
Yeah. So again, I think this is again another dichotomy, which I think, particularly in terms of Indian kind of discourse around popular histories, is a misleading dichotomy, right? That there are some kinds of historians who are only interested in abstract kind of explanations of social change. Marxists are somehow seen as kind of exhibit A of that kind of tendency. And then there are others who believe that individuals matter a lot and that we have to, bring individuals back into that history. But, funnily enough, it was Marx who said that, people make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, right? That really, to me, captures what historians' real sort of problem is, which is that we have to explain what individuals are doing, but we also have to explain in what context they are doing those things and how that context shapes, changes, modifies the outcomes of what they try to do. And which is exactly the kind of argument that I was making here, which is that, it is not enough for us to say what Indira Gandhi wanted. It is also very important for us to understand what she managed to accomplish. And oftentimes in history, what people accomplish from a historical vantage point is actually quite different from what they may have intended. And this is not purely an unintended consequences story. It is happens because people operate in historical circumstances which have other kinds of elements which are operating. So even the most powerful actor in any political system can rarely get their own way and get the outcomes that they want. And that is for us a very important thing to remember. So that is not to diminish the role of the individual, but to precisely place that individual in the historical context. And I think that is an important point for us to sort of remember, because I think there's a lot of sense that popular history is best told through individual stories, whereas academic history operates through something else. I think those are all misleading dichotomies which we have to do this thing, right? Historians have to work hard to reach out to people. We cannot take audiences or readers for granted, definitely. But I think these kinds of ways of thinking about it, which I find is somewhat disturbingly prevalent in the Indian context, right? Indian historians don't care about individuals. They don't think about biography as an important thing. No, it's not the case. The question is, what do you do with the life of an individual, right? Rather than whether you think the life is intrinsically important or not.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think when you made your presentation as well, and I think part of the richness of the book comes from not just that Srinath is making an argument about assessing Indira Gandhi's tenure, but the archival work that he's done, and he explained the process. I think the telling anecdote, a particular, and even in your talk, you referred to actual quotes from Indira Gandhi's correspondence. And I think that for me certainly was a very new element. The exchanges between her and her father, her and Haksar, across several decades, really bring to life also this particular personality and how she's engaging with it. I'm going to just read out, and just so people have a sense of the style that Srinath, in case you haven't read him. I've read some of Srinath's work. I haven't read all. I'm very glad that I got to read this. But I was telling Srinath just before we started that I've actually read a short chapter that he wrote in a book which in my field, I do comparative constitutional studies, and I look at legal systems in Asia generally. This is a book which Ram Guha edited in 2014. It's called Makers of Modern Asia. Those of you who are familiar with Ram's work. He's written a book on Makers of Modern India, and this seemed like an extension of that. And Srinath wrote the chapter on Indira Gandhi in 2014. That's a 29-page chapter, which is now developed into a 300-page book. That book was reviewed by a scholar called Robin Jeffrey. Srinath cites him. Robin Jeffrey has written, I think it's still regarded as one of the classics when it comes to the study of newspapers in India. Robin was born in Canada, came to India under the RIE program, taught English in Chandigarh, learned Punjabi, I think, and he writes about both Punjab and Kerala. And Robin, who at that time lived in Singapore, and the book has profiles of important Asian leaders, Indira Gandhi and Lee Kuan Yew being two of them. He writes this review, and I'll just read out because I thought it captures the spirit both of the chapter and of the book. So Robin says, this is from a review, an academic review, which came out in a journal called Pacific Affairs, published in Canada in 2015. And Robin says, Raghavan's essay surprised me. I expected to be a bit bored by a story that I thought I knew well. But Raghavan, like Guha, works in the archives like a beaver in a forest. And I thought that was a good description. I think Ram Guha himself has talked about being an archive rat. Maybe in the world of animals, I would say beavers are probably preferable to rats. And Robin has this wonderful way of capturing that. And I think this book, and I wonder if Robin will have a chance to see this, because he will find that Srinath's beaverish habits have only expanded. And there are many, many little, nuggets which he's dug out and put in the book. He goes on to say, and he writes well. I think Robin is a Canadian of a certain vintage, and that's high praise coming from Robin. Finally, he says, and this is what I wanted to really go on about. He says he provides as insightful and fast-moving account of India from the 1960s to the 1980s as one will find. And that's what I was reminded of when I read this elongated version from, as Srinath said, 1966 to 1984 in 10 chapters. Right? It's gripping. You also get a sense of how monumental those changes were. Right? And every generation thinks that it's gone through a remarkable period, and what's happening now is unprecedented. But it's really, and Srinath's talk told us about the economic changes, the political changes, the changes to party structures that was happening in that time. And that was quite fascinating. And now to a question, and to allow Srinath to sort of elaborate. So the end of the talk, you said three things that you really focused on: changes to the political system, changes of doing politics, the style of politics, and finally, the change to political economy. And I wondered if you want to talk I think in the epilogue, you say the most impactful of these three, possibly, is the changes to political economy, right? And one of the pleasures of reading this book again is, you refer to the great classic authors when it comes to political economy. My colleague is here. We were just having a discussion about political science that is taught in Indian universities. Unfortunately, a lot of these scholars are not taught anymore in a regular political science department. Francine Frankel, the Rudolphs, and many of what they were sort of talking about. But I think what you ended with, and I think this will surprise some people and you'll probably get some pushback, but one of the things I study is the regulatory state in India. And I was very intrigued. And I would say I'll have to probably digest it and then get back. But perhaps you can elaborate, why do you say in the epilogue that the most impactful period of the long 1970s, so not just Indira Gandhi, she was of course an actor in many of these events, is the effect that period had on political economy?
Yeah. So as I said, I mean, there are two aspects of political economy which changed in this long period, which I think are quite salient. So one is this kind of, move towards getting the state to relax its grip on the economy, right? Deregulation. And as I said, again, it was not done because of a desire to deregulate. It was not done because there was some clear vision that you wanted something called liberalization of the variety that you get in 1991. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that what happened in 1991 began exactly in the same way there. But history doesn't move in straight lines, right? I mean, so sometimes, there's a quote by Bertolt Brecht, the German poet that I sort of use in the book, where he says that, if there are obstacles, the shortest distance between 2 points may be a crooked line, right? I mean, that's the way history moves. I mean, it doesn't move in straight lines always. And one of the crooked lines here that we see is that, a very powerful prime minister who's actually claims that she's an advocate of socialism, is under the force of circumstances actually forced to do things which go against the grain of her own liking, thinking, everything else. And what you get as a result of that is a consensus within the Indian system, which starts building up from the mid-1970s, that we need to move to some very different kind of a model. And that absolute regime change, so to speak, in that economic sense, happens only in 1991. But things are kind of already moving in the direction of what needed to be done. But the second aspect of it, because this is one aspect, right, about the state and the sort of, particularly the private sector and the economy. But the second aspect of it is, how does the state think of its role in development, right? See, the Nehruvian state had a clear kind of developmental model. And that developmental model was to be achieved through 5-year plans. The basic developmental model was what you would think of as structural transformation of the Indian economy. That you needed to get people from farm to factory, or some sort of variant of that through economic planning, is the way that was thought about, right? And the idea was that poverty as a problem would get addressed as this transition happens. People will move to relatively higher sort of, more, roles which are economically productive, which will then mean that it'll be more remunerative for them, etc. That is seen to be the answer to the very serious problem of poverty which independent India inherits. But by the time we come to the mid-1960s, and not just because of Indira Gandhi, but because of a range of sort of, reality checks which the planning system has to take into account, you come up with a very different imaginary of how to deal with the problem of poverty. Now, poverty is now seen not as something which can be alleviated over time, but as this absolutely terrible condition for at least certain sections which needs to be addressed in the here and now, right? And that means that you start embarking on targeted welfare anti-poverty schemes for various groups, right? You need to first measure those groups. So you come up with ideas like poverty line. Okay, who is below the poverty line? That tells us, but then the question becomes, where do we peg the poverty line, right? And then that debate continues over several decades. But this idea that obviously we are not a rich enough country to universalize all of these provisions. So they have to be targeted, they have to be given to certain groups. And that particular way of thinking about not just poverty alleviation, but development as a whole, in some ways is, I think, the most important consequence of the long 1970s for our thing. And in some ways, I mean, if I can put my cards on the table, I think it's one of the most deleterious sort of consequences of that period, is because, it has stunted our developmental imagination, and it has made our politics hostage to a certain model of political economy, which I think is in the long run bad both for our economy and for democracy. It is bad for democracy because, this whole regime of welfare that we deal with is actually, contrary to all appearances, highly depoliticizing. I mean, when people are called labhartis, that is exactly what the system intended. You're just a beneficiary, right? I mean, you're not a right-seeking citizen. You're not someone who's active, who's trying. So I just feel that is something which came out. And if you ask my normative judgment on it, I think it's actually quite deeply problematic. I mean, what is the alternative we can discuss later, but that was definitely, I think, to my mind, if I'm sitting here in 2025, the most important economic or political economic consequence of what happened in the 1970s.
Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions and we'll start moving towards the area that I'm more familiar with, constitutional law. And I think one of the implications, so there's been a debate amongst people who write about the Indian Constitution on something that you address quite centrally. So I was just saying that there's been a debate amongst people who study the Indian Constitution on what is referred to as the centralizing drift, right? And one question is the Constitution by design from the 1950s onwards, from the time of it was made? Because as you said, the people who drafted our Constitution were already in power. They already wanted to bring about the developmental state. So there's a very centralized focus from the beginning, right? And is that the problem, or is that something that happened along the way? So for me, in chapter 2, you start by saying Indira Gandhi has just won the 1971 election, as you described. That was a huge moment. But almost immediately, she asks for L.K. Jha to be replaced by P.N. Haksar. And then, as you described, the PMO then becomes extremely powerful very quickly, right? To the detriment of the cabinet secretariat, to others. So this is clearly a very important change, and I think we broadly had a sense of it, but you've given us evidence of exactly how it happens, right? And you focus a lot on Haksar and particularly how he goes about doing this. We know in later years you have the call and the dhars. Mohan Kumar Amangalam also becomes part of the inner circle, and the sort of change that is happening, right? So that's clearly something very significant. And I think as I was reading your work, I began to say there may have been a design issue from the beginning, but during the Nehruvian years, Nehru never really took it. He did occasionally, and we know when he imposed president's rule in Kerala and other instances, but by and large, he tried to involve and respect the other two agents. Right? My last question will be about the judiciary, because you commented on that, but maybe just staying on the executive and the significance of that. You've alluded to it, I think it's clear, but you are now making a historical argument about when that centralization really becomes part of our legal system. So just a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, again, I mean, see, obviously I'm not a scholar of constitutional law, but I follow the literature that you're alluding to. And I think there is a tendency to say that, listen, the centralizing drift is there from the very beginning. The constitution itself has got, in fact, Gautam Bhatia has a book which was out, I think, last year, which actually makes this argument at some length. Now, the only problem with that is that it puts too much onus on structure as opposed to agency of people, right? I mean, so again, I think the contrast with the Nehruvian period is interesting because one of the things that Jawaharlal Nehru did was a certain degree of voluntary self-restraint, not just vis-a-vis, other institutions, but even vis-a-vis other colleagues within his own party and so on, right? I mean, in fact, even at the time when Nehru was prime minister, I quote, and I think you were alluding to one of those letters, Indira Gandhi writes to him in 1957-58 saying that, you're just letting state chief ministers run the show in a way that is totally unacceptable. I mean, why are you doing it? But his sense always was that parliamentary democracy, and I think that is one very important norm, actually operates on a considerable degree of self-restraint on part of all actors. The minute you decide to throw off that self-restraint, and then it is all gloves, if they come off, then the game is going to become something which is much more, nasty in the way that it plays out. So I think Nehru had that kind of a sense, right? I mean, even the way that he dealt with Parliament, for instance, in 1964, I mean, he's trying to get a parliamentary sort of, a constitutional amendment through, and there is not enough quorum in the House. And he says that, no, we'll convene again when there is. And this is that man who's literally on his deathbed. I mean, so he had that kind of a sense. Again, we know all the instances where, the president's rule and various kinds of things, First Amendment, all of that stuff. None of that is taken away. But I think he had a general sense that for the workings of a system like this, there is a degree of restraint that all actors need to restrain. Similarly, I would say even with the judiciary, right? I mean, after the early sort of bruises over land reforms and stuff, even the judiciary actually exercises considerable levels of restraint in that period. And, Madhav Khosla has a paper about some of that stuff, which I think is an interesting illustration of the dynamic in that period generally, was that, we need to make a system work. So let's try and hold a little bit back rather than, go all in. So I think that definitely changes. And again, that doesn't change immediately, right? I mean, it only changes when Indira Gandhi feels that the principal threat to her own position is actually from Congress colleagues, right? That is the moment when all bets are off, right? And then you start centralizing, you start slowly aggregating power. But even that aggregation of power is not purely by design, right? I mean, she may have wanted it, but there is no reason she should have had it. She only had it because certain election victories turned out in certain ways, certain kind of wars turned out in certain ways, right? So there was an opportunity to kind of, events also afforded her a lot. And Harold Macmillan says, I mean, events are very important in politics. So they have their own dynamic as well. So I think there is definitely a historical shift. And I wouldn't sort of subscribe to this argument that from the very beginning, this is what we were setting ourselves up for.
Thanks. My last question, and this is again my sort of identity as a legal scholar sort of comes in. So you mentioned, three important arguments that you're taking on. I should say, reading it as a law student, there are many important lawyers who come up, right? Even in the cast of characters, Indira Gandhi, really relied on a set of lawyers, and they come to life because you give us helpful backgrounds on these people and tell us about them. In your presentation also, you referred to this. So, all the things that you mentioned. And I know there are law students in the audience. So bank nationalization, privy purses, then you get into, the 42nd Amendment and all of that. All of these led to cases. So the last two cases you were talking about President's rule and how the Janata government dismisses all the Congress governments. That leads to State of Rajasthan versus Union of India, and later on as well. So I'm just thinking, going away from the executive to other institutions and how they are behaving. So we know that in the early part, when people like Justice Subbarao were there, the judiciary, as you said, so the judiciary is by and large, okay with the Nehruvian period. They are very deferential. They recognize this is an independence generation, so they tend to back up. But at the start of her tenure, there's a big pushback from the judiciary, and that leads to the great battle. And then you say by the late 70s, the judiciary is also sort of holding back, or as I think the phrase you used was rubber stamping, right? So I'm just thinking across how does one think of the long 70s for institutional health generally? And I think of the judiciary, today's papers are reporting Chief Justice Gawai yesterday gave a speech where he again extolled the role that the judiciary has played in upholding the Constitution, right? It's 75 years of the Constitution as well, and the judiciary obviously believes that it's been one of the pillars of the country in holding that up. So since you've studied really critical judicial decisions and not as a lawyer or a law student, I think you have a unique vantage point to comment on, at least in the long 70s. What's your assessment of the judiciary and what it's?
Sure. Now, health and safety warning is that what I'm about to say may, harm the sort of law students particularly. So don't take me as a lawyer, right? So I think the problem really starts in my reading with the decision of the Supreme Court in the Golaknath case. Yeah. And as I see it as a historian, that was an entirely political decision. I think the constitutional precedents for giving that kind of a restraint on what could be done, etc., were not available. Justice Subbarao and others are on record as saying that they were worried about the authoritarian tendencies of Indira Gandhi, etc. So they thought that the judiciary has to sort of create some bulwarks, right? But what does Justice Subbarao do soon after? He resigns as Chief Justice of India and runs for the presidency as the opposition's candidate. So what do you expect Indira Gandhi to do? Should she not come to this right conclusion that the judiciary is kind of not operating by established norms, but is actually playing some very different game, which is exactly what they came to? Of course, the conclusions which they drew from it were that, all bets are off. We have to now really get out of the judiciary, which is exactly what they proceeded to. So as I see it, actually 1967 is really the starting point of trouble even with the judiciary, right? And again, I mean, the cases and other things is obviously, a lot of toing and froing. It has been studied in great detail. But if you look at, say, what happens by 1973, Keshwananda Bharati stuff, right? I mean, as a historian, again, I'll say I'm not a student of the constitutional law, but the whole sort of claim that there is a basic structure to the Constitution which is unamendable, to me strikes as an extraordinary departure from everything that was happening in Indian constitutional history up until that point of time. It was an extraordinary claim. I mean, whether we agree, whether we think that claim is true, whether it is good, it is a practically good device for us to have checks and balances, etc. But the idea that there is some aspect of a document which we have collectively self-legislated, which is not open at all. Pratap Mehta recently said that that's like claiming that it's a Sanatan Dharma. Absolutely correct. It is actually as, whatever, extraordinary a claim as that, saying that something is going to be valid forever and that no human agency can change it. So as I see it, from a political perspective, I think the executive really felt that the judiciary was overreaching itself. And then they, of course, went on to. So which only sort of, my argument in this book is that the rules of the game became sort of so frayed precisely because nobody felt that there was anything great to be gained by abiding. And I think that aspect of collective behavior is something that we have to recognize. And we all paid a very heavy price for it, right? Through the emergency, what happens after the emergency, both for Indira Gandhi, the Janata government, all the tragedy and farce that ensues thereafter, is all a result of this stuff. Which is why I really feel that, when you look at this entire period, I think the historian's verdict is best given in terms of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where the prince says in the last act that all are punished. That's exactly what happens in the 1970s. All are punished. And all deserve to be punished, at least in this historian's judgment, right? So,
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.